Hey, I have a second channel. Cube Comp MTDX.
Hey everybody, try to take the opportunity to talk about ATX12VO. ATX12VO is a new power supply specification from Intel, which consolidates the power supply down to a simple 12 volt DC supply. It supplies 12 volt DC to the motherboard, and the motherboard in the computer is then responsible for converting that 12 volt DC to your 3.3, your 5 volts, those other voltages to run various components on the motherboards as well as drives in the system. And ATX12VO right now, it seems to be more aimed toward the OEM sector. Brands like Dell, HP, those for example. They've already been implementing a similar, not exactly ATX12VO, but they've been implementing sort of their own proprietary version of it for quite some time now. And I'm not much of a fan of it, really, to be honest. I think it drives up the cost of motherboards to have to add circuitry to the motherboard to handle conversion from 12 volts to 3.3 volts and 5 volts. And the supposed claim about ATX12VO is it's more efficient because the motherboard now handles conversion from 12 volts to 5 volts and 3.3 volts. They basically take it out of the power supply unit and put it on the motherboard. And I mean, like I say, I've got some examples of I got a few motherboards here that use a similar technology, and I've parted out systems that were dead that used a similar type of setup. Those units, the power supply unit generates pretty much just 12 volts, and I think a 12 volt standby. Instead, yeah, even the standby rail is 12 volts, which it functions similar to a standard power supply where there is a on state and a soft off state, where the unit either is in standby and it's generating a standby voltage, or the unit is running, supplying 12 volts to the motherboard, which is powering everything else. So I've gotten systems in before, and this isn't, like I say, this is not exactly a knock against ATX12VO. It's just some similar issues I've seen with computers that use this type of setup. So in years past, and what I'll try to do is I'll try to link videos up here whenever I can find them. One example would be when I used to work at the ITS area of the local community college. We got several computers in where the SATA power connectors on the optical drives just completely burnt up. The customers would put in help desk tickets saying their computer's smoking, and I'd go out there and I'd of course walk in the office, and the office smelled like something was on fire, and I open up the computer, and sure enough, the power connector to the drive is just completely burnt up. And I think I may have those right here. Actually, I got one right here. So the computer in question was a HP 6000 Pro MT, which uses a power delivery setup similar to ATX12VO. The power supply in it generates 12 volt DC, and the motherboard does onboard conversion from 12 volts to 5 volts and 3.3 volts. And of course, the computer has a connected desktop hard disk drive and a full-size optical drive, both of which got their power directly from the motherboard. And for some reason, apparently the short circuit protection was not very effective in those systems, because look at this connector right here. Get you a look at that, if it'll focus on it instead of me. Yeah, look at that. Now, of course, it's been sitting around for a while, so it's actually got a little corroded. you can see where the 12, actually the 12 volt side of things really just burnt up. And my opinion on the matter is, perhaps if the power supply unit was directly powering the drive and this shorted, the power supply would see that short circuit much easier, and the short circuit protection would probably operate a little quicker. Because in the setup you have the motherboard in the middle of it, you've got extra resistance there, and now the motherboard, I can say the motherboards in those systems did not fry. We actually replaced the CD driver, the DV burner, and the affected cables using parts out of donor systems, and the system would work fine. So yeah, the HP 6000 Pro MTs at the time, they were already getting phased out of the organization. I want to say, I can't remember the exact model of the system that it was a newer model of HP Tower, very similar to it. It was a little newer. Instead of being Core 2 quad based, those systems had i5s. But don't recall having that issue with him. But yeah, it's just something that can happen with the setup when the power supply is not directdirectly feeding auxiliary components like your drives. If something shorts out on a connector, generally I would think if the connector was connected directly to the power supply unit, the short circuit protection would work more effectively in that matter. Another example would be, now this is actually more of a positive. So maybe with ATX12VO, if the system, if the OEMs would mass adopt this specification, it may be easier to find replacement power supplies for these affected systems, because the system I just mentioned, the HP 6000 Pro MT, as well as every other computer I've ever gotten in for service that used a 12 volts only power supply. Those power supplies, like if it was an HP or if it was a Dell system, the power supply burnt up, you'd have to go to HP or Dell for replacement. Matter of fact, I got a scrap system right over here. It's a Dell system where the power supply was already pulled out of it, and of course it was a 12 volt only supply. And if it was a regular ATX, of course I could just drop in a power supply and probably would solve the problem. But since it was proprietary design, well, there you have it. Kind of screwed. So maybe ATX12VO would be a good thing in that regard. It would sort of maybe force the OEMs to sort of standardize the power supply yet again. It seems like we're going with this yet again. Years ago, Dell, for example, they had their own proprietary pinouts, and Compaq did as well. Around 2000, 2001 on the Compaq Desk Pro EN systems. I used to get my hands on them things all the time when I was in high school, and they use a 24-pin connector to the motherboard, which was not wired as a standard ATX connector. I mean, a Pentium 3 system with a 24-pin motherboard connector. Yeah, it wasn't a standardized 24-pin connector, because what would happen is you ever plugged in a 24-pin power supply to that motherboard would actually go up in smoke. Yes, I actually burned up a couple in the past. Way back in 2006. This is actually on the Cube Plexi, because the Plexi, the original iteration of the Cube Plexi, was using spare parts off of a Compaq Desk Pro EN. The motherboard, the power supply, you name it, those components, it was just basically transferred over. So I've got some other examples of computers around here that use a similar setup to a 12 volt VO. Now these computers, they actually take in 19 volts from a laptop power supply, and they do DC conversion from 19 volts to 12 volts to 5 volts to 3.3 volts. So, for example, would be the little TV box computers I have. The one that used to be in the tech room in the old single wide. It's actually, I got it right up here on the shelf right now. I'm going to eventually get it back up and running. I don't know. But I got also the TV Box Cube, which is in the master bedroom. It's a HP Mini ATX style board that has a power supply input on the back. You actually power these off of a HP style laptop supply. 65 watt supply actually will run it. And it has, of course, the built-in circuitry on board to provide power to one connected CD drive and one connected hard drive, and that's it. So anyways, ATX12VO, I personally don't like the design. I think it does have its purpose. It maybe will force these OEMs to sort of get their act together and stop using their own proprietary power supply designs. But really, to be honest, one of the big claims about ATX12VO is it's more efficient because the power supply now has less circuitry on board. It just provides 12 volts to the motherboard, and the motherboard then does DC-DC conversion. But because of that, now motherboard prices will be more expensive because the motherboards will have to do this, will have to add this additional componentry to handle power supply needs, and you also have a higher risk of something burning up on the motherboard because, let's say, something's shorted in a connector like this. I personally prefer to have power supply components in the power supply, not the motherboard. And the good news, it seems that, at least right now, in the retail/enthusiast market, everything is mostly remaining typical ATX, where the power supply itself handles everything power supply related. And to be honest, newer power supplies, and this kind of debunks the claim about ATX 12 volt or 12VO being more efficient, is a lot of newer power supplies nowadays, they already basically do this. They supply 12 volts internally, and they also have DC to DC conversion for 5 volts and 3.3 volts, which is more efficient. So they're still doing this more efficient means of supplying the 3.3 volt and 5 volt rails. And the thing is, modern computers don't really make much use of 5 volts and 3.3 volts. I mean, now of course we got USB and stuff like that, which runs on 5 volts, but a lot of the power hungry stuff nowadays uses the 12 volt rail. So it makes sense for modern power supplies to focus mainly on the 12 volt side of things and using DC to DC conversion to supply those auxiliary rails like the 5 volts and 3.3 volts. Again, that's why you can look at a lot of modern power supplies. I mean, for example, this one right here, I don't know for sure if this one does use DC to DC conversion to supply its auxiliary rails, but if you look at it, this is a 265 watt supply, and it says near the bottom, the 12 volt A and 12 volt B shall not exceed 240 watts. I mean, 240 watts, 265 watts. 240 watts is the vast majority of that. So there is a possibility this unit could have DC to DC conversion built in, and thus be able to supply the bulk of its power just on 12 volts. Now, like I say, again, in my opinion, it makes more sense for the power supply unit to be a power supply unit and handle everything regarding power supply to the computer. Let the motherboard be motherboard. Don't force the motherboard to have to handle power supply duties. But then again, as I mentioned, ATX12VO, I think it does have its place in the OEM sector. Maybe it'll force the OEMs to get their acts together and stop doing things their own way again, making you have to buy their power supplies if their power supply fails. But anyways, that's kind of my opinions on ATX12VO. Again, it's a whole new thing, and I don't. From my understanding, I think there was one motherboard from AceRock that implemented ATX12VO, but it's like you can't hardly find. To my understanding, you can't hardly find power supplies in the retail sector that are ATX12VO. It's still ATX12VO, which I think, of course, has been around for a long time, and there's lots of cross compatibility there. Now, of course, older power supplies are not super 12 volt heavy. but you can still use older power supplies on low end stuff. If you're building like a low end system, you could of course use the existing supply like one up there. I mean, I've done it several times actually with super low end stuff. But yeah, that's my opinions on the ATX12VO. Hope you enjoyed this video. Thanks for watching.
Well, everybody, that wraps it up for this video, and I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please like the video. Also, don't forget to subscribe to Computer Channel, and be sure to tick that bell so you'll get notified when new videos are posted. Also, don't forget, I have a whole lot of other interesting videos here on the channel to check out. And also, in addition, I have a second channel, CubeComp where I have all sorts of other videos not exactly related to technology. Links to the channels are available at the end of this video. Again, I thank you for your support and thanks for watching this video.